Hello, my name's Michael Wemedemo. I live and work in Port Harcourt, the oil capital of Nigeria, and I'm the project director of CMAP.
Hello everybody, I'm Caroline Skinner. I live in Cape Town and I'm based at the African Centre for Cities. So informality, as I understand, is often defined in terms of deficits. So in the housing space, it's deficits in infrastructure, in access to shelter, water, sanitation. And in my world of where I focus much more on informal work, it's defined in terms of deficits again, of not having access to basic social protections. You know, we as a network have worked very hard on statistics, on trying to quantify how many people in the world don't have access to basic protections. In a continent like ours, this also includes a lot of people who are self-employed and are making their own way in tiny enterprises. So think street vendor, waste picker, home-based worker, all the transport that's done. And it does lead one to question whether if it incorporates most work, which it does, 90% of work on this continent is informal, then does it perhaps disguise more than it reveals? So it'd be lovely to hear in your work how you see this notion land.
So in Nigeria, 80% of all physical development is outside of government control. Although informal physical development is very often described in the language of marginality, as if it's a peripheral condition. It is in fact the core urban condition. And it's not only the condition of the poor. Many banks, many supermarkets, perhaps the governor's mansion has been informally built. And so what we have found is that the language that it's very often used to describe the informal urban spaces, the self-built spaces, tend to be punitive. They're often called illegal developments. And the implications of these framings tend to be harsh, tend to be violent, a lot of displacement. So for us, the question is, how can we shift understandings of the ways in which cities on this continent are being built? How can we move from a situation where the people who are actually shaping the face of our cities are excluded from all the processes of formal decision making? How can we open the door and let them in?
We work alongside worker-based movements across the continent, and they have this rallying call of nothing about us without us. So in a very similar way, they're saying, you know, let us be part of the design process, let us be part of the kind of policy processes. And that's the route to something quite transformative. And I wondered whether there was a little echo in the housing space of where you do secure some gains, if it's in water and sanitation or shelter, from the state.
I think so. People, in the first instance, live where they can.
Yeah.
They seek out opportunity. They live close to where they work. And indeed, commercial space and domestic space in many informal settlements is very closely integrated. And you see many aspects that are now recognized as desirable in the informal sector. You see walkability. You see very close community. You see a really rich and various usage of space. But of course, you don't want to romanticize the situation, because despite the term informality, in many ways, this is a condition that has been deliberately cultivated by governments through a process of sustained neglect, which is punctuated by eruptions of extreme violence, usually forced evictions. So I think what's really important to do is to try and create networks of solidarity in these spaces, so that communities can consolidate themselves. And for that to happen, governments, state governments, municipal governments need to stop treating people as the problem and recognize both need and potential.
There's a kind of common thread of collective action and of also us as urbanites being less arrogant. We don't have the solutions, and sometimes our beautiful designs and our kind of, parachuting in to do something that feels like it would be transformational is often not the route to go. So it's much more slow-paced practice, one that is, cultivates careful listening skills, that is one of really trying to build consensus, sometimes between kind of quite conflictual ideas and thoughts.
So cultivating this capacity for slow listening, a patience, also requires, I think, a capacity to live with the tensions between this slow rhythm and the intense rapidity with which our cities are growing. Because our cities are growing faster than our formal institutions have the capacity, or have displayed so far the capacities, or deployed the capacities to cater for. So informality will be a condition that our cities exhibit for many years to come. So we have to develop more productive relationships with it. And that, I think, necessarily will involve the recognition that the formal systems need to change. That informality, as we see it, is not simply a stubborn intransigence. It's not some miscreants on the periphery who are refusing to comply. This is a result of the way in which this continent is urbanizing.
And maybe, this is a profoundly interesting challenge to the urban designers, the urban planners, the architects, the engineers. If most buildings and most work on the continent are designed outside of their purview, in some ways, the hope is that this kind of coarse material shows that it's perhaps one of the most dynamic and urgent spaces to be intervening in. And I kind of watch the urban practitioners like yourself who are really doing the innovative work, and it feels like there's a dynamism that has kind of got under your skin, that is not about romanticizing what's there, but also kind of working with it. And that's why this is a kind of particularly interesting and important space to be operating in.
Yes. In the daily enterprises of survival of millions of people, cities are being fashioned. And it's important to seize the intensely adaptive, improvisatory, creative and resourceful dynamics that allow people to keep body and soul together. Again, this is not to romanticize the situation. It's to realize that these are not abject spaces of total lack. That these are spaces with actual institutions, with representative leaderships, with management capacity, with design capacity. And if we can engage that, if we can draw on that, then we can spatially, socially, culturally transform neighborhoods that are home to the urban majority, but nevertheless persist in our imaginations as somehow peripheral.
And could I layer one additional element within this? Because I think that we need to have kind of a savvy, constant picking up of the power dynamics, both the micro power dynamics in terms of gender, sexuality, but also the macro power dynamic.
Communities are structured by many exclusions and repressions, many forms of violence also. And that means that in engaging in self-built communities, one also has to address these issues of violence and exclusion. And at the same time, it's important not to be naive. Poverty is big business. And there are many times where we have seen private-public partnerships which are in fact land grabs by politicians and their associates in the business sector. So one of the challenges is to develop robust demand-side platforms, grassroots networks, which will create conditions for accountability. That is key. Representative, accountable governance is critical for transforming these spaces. To conclude, people make cities. That's one of the clear characteristics of informality, often without state assistance, and if they can create cities, they can transform cities. So there's certainly hope. Hope is important, but so is humility, I think, on the part of official institutions. A willingness to listen, the capacity to empathize and to understand, and the commitment to recognize the value that is created and shared by people living in self-built communities. And also, I think, courage, because it is true that many of our institutions have been distorted by perverse incentives. And sometimes it takes courage for someone working in government to move away from business as usual